everyone. I just want to briefly introduce the class in this video. Uh, I'm your lecturer this term, Bo Earl. I'm a professor in the English department. Um, I, just to go straight into the introduction of the class, I'm kind of an unlikely teacher for this class, so this is an unlikely class for me to teach. Insofar as my specialization, what I was hired here to teach is romantic poetry. I mostly um, do romantic philosophy, which is philosophy of the Romantic period, which is the um, period following the French Revolution, and motivated by the ideals of the French Revolution, freedom, um, self liberty of the individual, um, and these are related to concern for nature and questioning of reason, law, rationality, civilization. So nature, imagination, emotion, um, are values that are explored in romantic philosophy and poetry alike. So nonfiction prose, it's kind of like the opposite of everything romantic. It's like prosaic. Prose and poetry are implicitly opposed, and that's going to be a big something we're going to spend a lot of time exploring. That opposition or duality. Um, but this class has turned out to be one of my favorite classes that I've ever taught. And uh, so um, I and Let me just say right from the start, I think, as I've already indicated to you in some messages, that I'm approaching the idea of nonfiction very skeptically in this class. Um, so the idea that reality could be represented in an objective rather than subjective way. That it could be represented in a term that I'm going to refer to quite a bit in a derogatory way, pejorative term, the objective view from nowhere. The idea that we can see the premise of objectivity, of scientific empiricism, that there's a perspective available to us that is not a subjective perspective, that is not a particular perspective, that isn't embodied in a particular context at a particular moment in history, but is sheerly transcendent and offers simply fact, the view from nowhere. I'm going to be suggesting in this class that's a very useful conceit, a very useful hypothesis for the scientific method, a kind of regulatory fiction, an ideal to work toward. But that is not the same as anything, actual that we actually represent in our language, in our prose. So that's a focus of the class is what are we doing when we try to speak the truth, and how, and I want to suggest that it's very important. But it's not because it's non-fictional. It's not because it's telling us what is objectively true, but has more to do with communication, the experience of sharing. So communication doesn't depend on accuracy. Indeed. Ian McGilchrist will, one of the first writers that we'll be looking at, a sort of philosopher and psychologist and neuroscientist, points out that it's estimated that 90% of our communication among humans, is nonverbal. Uh, so what that means, all this talking that we're doing, that's not what we actually communicate. So most of our communication is by gesture, body language, um, and so what we say is often kind of a dance that we do. It's the occasion for a dance, that is the real means of our communication. I invite you to think about that when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your family. Um, what do you think? Try to reflect critically on what you're communicating and how you're communicating it. What is actually going on? We say all this stuff, um, but is that actually the primary content of the communication? Um, Instead, I think a lot of what we say, it's just about communicating a kind of agreement, kind of mutual recognition, emotional regulation, synchronization. A lot more like dancing and music than just simple. What we think we're doing is communicating. I have a piece of information in my head, I'm transmitting it to your head, and back and forth. Um, it's interesting that that's what we think we're doing, but 90% of what we're doing is not that. So communication, talking, texting. Texting is a great example. You could say, like, what's body language have to do with texting? Well, think of the role of emojis in texting. Um, it's so much of texting is gestural, right? Not information. Even like we have such a limited, digital vocabulary when we're texting, but we use that, and we creatively have molded that in to invent gestures. So that's actually a really good example, I would say, of body language, texting, communication. Um, so I've compared that to dancing, music, that it's more like a dancing and musical kind of communication. And indeed, Ian McGilchrist is going to suggest, make the case that music and poetry precede prosaic language, representational, denotational language that would represent objects empirically out there in the world. First, we sang together, then language, a representational, objective language developed as an offshoot of song and poetry. So another example I'm going to give you here, maybe of an activity that's even more basic than to us, seemingly, than singing or dancing together, riding a bicycle. So we all think we know what we're doing when we ride a bicycle, or we teach. This is about teaching a kid to ride a bicycle. We have our rational, explicit, non-fictional, prosaic, verbal, linguistic understanding of what we do. We balance, we turn, but and that's what we teach when we teach a child how to ride a bicycle. But it turns out it's wrong in a really basic way. When what we might teach a child especially one that's learned how to ride on a trike, that you turn, what you want to go right, you turn right, you want to go left, you turn, move the handlebars to the left. That's what you do on a trike, but that's not what you do on a bicycle. It's a very complex whole body maneuver that you make on a bike where you lean and you actually do this maneuver called counter steering, where the bars actually move in the opposite direction of how you turn when you lean the bike over. So the point of this little instructional video here, it's explaining the idea of counter steering, or the point of the video is to introduce the idea of counter steering, but the narrator makes a comment along the way that I think is wonderful and is the key, I think, a key theme of this class and education in general, which is that the student learns in spite of the instruction, out of a sense of survival. You have to practically complete the task. The instruction is supposedly telling you how to do that, but oftentimes what you have to learn to complete the task successfully is in spite of the instruction, or the instruction is a like alibi, or disguises a real underlying like practical lesson that is the crucial thing that you're learning.
Most often, our first vehicle had 3 wheels, like this tricycle. Turn the bars to the right, and it goes right. Turn to the left, and it goes left. Simple. Our first ventures out on 2 wheels usually involved training wheels. Now we have a 4-wheeler. From the tricycle experiences, we instinctively turn right to go right, and it works. In the time-honoured method of training, we raise the training wheels. Now we have a recipe for disaster. We've lost 2 wheels. It's now a frighteningly unstable machine. The child expects it to steer like everything else she's ridden. Look what happens, though. She steers to the right, and the bike tips over to the left, just like all 2-wheeled devices.
Let's go for it.
Even with all the bad advice, out of our sense of survival, we somehow make it work.
She has never balanced
But do we
yet. Lower the training
understand
wheels, you'll kill
the
her.
underlying technology of it? All 2-wheeled vehicles steer differently to 3- and 4-wheelers. To go right, you apply pressure to the right handlebar. That action initiates the turn. The bike then leans over and the front wheel turns into the turn. It's called counter steering. That's why training wheels are so confusing at first. It's counter to everything the child has learned.
There you go. There you go. Hey, good job.
Out of a sense of survival, she somehow makes it work. I think so much of life, that describes so much of life. What we're actually doing, what we think we're doing, is often at odds with what we're actually doing. What we do to survive on so many levels, what we do to get through life, what we have as a species have done to survive over the course of our evolution, is unfathomably complex and subtle. Our understanding of what we do is often grotesquely simple, and it's not about actually understanding. It's about, again, communication, about establishing consensus about what's going on. Just a fictional conceit of about what reality is. That's what communication is for. It's about agreement, attunement, like, again, music, being in sync rather than being right, being correct. And if it's a workable lie, like the fiction of how we steer on a bike, if it works, that's all. That's what we need for the sake of communication. And hence, scientific method is not about being right. It's about being falsifiable. That's how the scientific method works, is making suggestions that are open to falsification, and that are acceptable only so long as they haven't yet been falsified. That's to say, just as a conceit. This is as if it were true. Prove to show that it isn't, and we'll take it as if it were true, so long as we can't falsify it. So I want to suggest to you that what I'm saying about riding a bike here is true also of the most, that's the most simple thing. Easy is riding a bike, we say. But it's all the more true of the more complex and profound, meaningful issues in our lives, what we do in our lives, what we're doing with our lives. Above all, like what it means to be a person, an individual, have your own life, have your own path in life, and pursue your identity, your personal identity. What does it mean to be a person? I want to suggest, it's a funny thing to say, but that's a very complex project, and a very, I think, culturally variable historical project. Maybe it's takes a certain meaning now in our modern world, world of consumer capitalism and personal liberty and freedom that it didn't have in the pre-modern, say, medieval world, where being a person wasn't so much about being a individual. It's like filling an inherited role, fulfilling, repeating, rehearsing the identity of one's ancestors. The roles that we fulfill involve very complex kind of imitation, emulation of role models that isn't as simple as just I see other examples of what it means to be a free individual that inspire me. Like, I see a reflection of what I want to be in myself. The texts that we're reading in this class, a lot of them are memoirs of adventure, in which characters are following heroes and trying to emulate them. And the books themselves are provide models to us readers that we might find inspiring and might want to emulate. But it's not so simple as just like, my father was a farmer, so I'm a farmer. Like, the identity is kind of legible on the surface. The point about adventure, the point I think about modern individuality, is that it's a kind of self-invention. What we're emulating is the act itself of self-creation. So it has this meta kind of structure or form. It's not just I do what you do in a kind of objective, empirical, connect the dots way. I can read what you did, and I do exactly the same thing in a kind of mechanical way. But what I'm emulating is an act without a determinate object. You made up your own action. You made up who you are, what the thing is that you're inventing. So I'm going to emulate that invention of what it is I'm doing, who it is I am. That see how that has a kind of a meta structure, and it's kind of godlike, Promethean, radically creative. Prometheus is a mythical figure we can try to emulate. We can try to be Promethean individuals ourselves, but not just by, mechanically doing the same thing he did, but it's by embodying a kind of spirit. It's a matter of metaphorical imitation or allegory. So you can see how like these poetic terms are sliding into the way I'm talking about life writing, non-fictional writing. The way metaphor structures our reality. To be free, that's something, there's not an objective, empirical way of explaining myself as a self-invented individual. And that's a paradox that we often overlook, that I wanted to draw our attention to. We live in a world, technological, rationalistic, materialistic world. We demand rational explanations from each other all the time. What are you doing? What are you doing in university? What's the cost-benefit analysis? Why does it make sense? We have to account for ourselves rationally. Even our sort of what seems non-productive, pointless activities, we tend to like rest and relaxation. That is itself productive, because then I'm like more productive because I did something unproductive to decompress. And if we don't, it's very risky to not have at least an alibi, a rational alibi for what we're doing. But I think if you think about it rationally, I'm going to give you a couple thought experiments to consider. So you're here at university, you can account for what you're doing in terms of like purpose, like I'm here to get training, to get a job so I can support myself, to have a family, and I don't know whatever story you want to tell yourself, you can kind of marshal a number of justifications, rational justifications for what you're doing. But in the end, I think there's always the question is, why are you? What are you for? What's you about? And even on a rational level, I think that there's an embarrassment in just saying, oh, this is what everybody does. This is what a person does. That's why I'm doing it. It doesn't, it's insufficient explanation. It's like, what, you're just doing it because everybody, that's the thing to do? Like, that's what your life is? It's just this mechanical, like, doing the obvious because it's the thing to do? It's insufficient, right? And so I think in the end, although we're embarrassed to admit it, we rely on imagination and this kind of metaphorical emulation of our heroes, what it means to lead a meaningful life. That relies on transmission of something like inspiration or passion, these metaphors for meaning, rather than anything objective, definite, that might explain ourselves. Another example, think about not yourself, but your best friends or lovers or the family, the most important people in your life. Why are they the most important? Explain your relationships. Can you um, justify them? Maybe you could say, yeah, my boyfriend, girlfriend, best friend, whatever is, you could say, have these qualities that make them benefit my life, like, yeah, I don't know, generous, intelligent, funny. You can list them all. Beautiful. Um, I don't know. Likewise with your family, you could, to give a kind of utilitarian justification for why you bond together, because that is in everybody's mutual interests. And um, but again, um, on a very, I think, superficial critical analysis, it doesn't make sense. First of all, if the only reason you love who you love, or and are connected to who you're connected to intimately, is because of a set of objective properties they have, then if somebody else were to come along who happened to have just a little bit more of any one of those, would your allegiance suddenly change? It wouldn't. So explanation is wrong. Um, your uh, your allegiance does not come from those objective properties, because there are always going to be other people that have them more. Um, your and same thing with family. The amount of investment that parents give to their children, Alison Gopnik will talk about this, is totally irrational. It does, or non-utilitarian. It doesn't pay back, and it was never the point. It would be absurd for a parent to say, to explain their feelings, their devotion to a child in terms of any rational profit motive. We're devoted 100% selflessly. Not in every case, of course, but I think the family feeling that we have for our family is generally one of absolute devotion, regardless of the potential benefits that we get from the relationship. That's how bonding works, is through the irrationality of our connections. So again, the commitment that we show to each other as individuals is very hard to explain without resorting to metaphors, poetic ideals, and so on. And so those are really crucial in life. The non-fictional, prosaic explanation of what we're doing with ourselves, with our lives. It's quite a poetic project, living the kind of lives that we do. And that's why I have this yin and yang symbol here, why it's been here. Conflict and opposition between reason and imagination, subjective emotion and objective knowledge. These structure our experience. We can't do without either. They're incompatible with each other, reason and imagination, but they're absolutely interdependent. Like black and white. It's like the duck rabbit illusion, if you're familiar with that. You can see a duck, you can see a rabbit, but you can't see both at once. I think that's really, a really key aspect of the yin and yang as well. which is to say that our seeing involves a kind of rhythm, involves a kind of temporality. You can't just see something. I mean, it's the relativity of space and time. Um, the, what we see spatially is also an intervention in time. It's a temporal action, splitting up the world in certain ways. We see what we see by blocking out other things. We're intervening in the world. I mentioned relativity because it's an important, albeit abstract, aspect of this whole thing, that empirical science is also has also reached the conclusion that time and space are relative, that there isn't any that the conceit again of empirical objectivity is a useful conceit for manipulating and controlling the world, for controlling people, exploiting the world in a lot of cases, but is not strictly true. To observe, supposedly from the view from nowhere, the sheer objective, to observe anything in the world is to intervene, is active. So there is no neutral perspective. Every perspective is an intervention, and so that's a key point I want to make about non-fictional prose. A key point I think that the writers I'm giving you to read make about it is that the non-fictional representation, representing life in as in a supposedly non-fictional way, is about acting in the world in a certain way. A lot of these writers are, and a lot of these writers and the subjects of a lot of the films that we're looking at are struggling with trauma, various kinds of dysfunction, various ways, struggling with the experience of having their world fall apart in different ways. We begin by looking at Zadie Smith talking about our world, the world of pandemic, and learning to. And there are stories of reconstructing the world, generally finding new metaphors to reorganize the world. Metaphors like peonies. Notice that the Zadie Smith's little piece is titled for something that does not exist in her story. Her non-fictional story is about something that does not exist. It's about the absence of peonies, right? So it's about the power of imagination. Somehow, the experience she describes, for all its lack of peonies, which is sort of a metaphor, allegory for the breakdown of community, of health, of experience, coherent experience. The pandemic is a breakdown. The world is not healthy. The systemic disease is a systemic breakdown. Pandemic is a systemic breakdown of society, the world in general. And that seems like kind of what's getting recognized there. The scene of the women looking at the tulips together, looking at each other looking. This, they're seeing each other seeing. Isn't that what we see when we look at the duck rabbit illusion or the yin yang? We see the act of seeing. It's a reflection of the action of moving from white to black, duck to rabbit. So it kind of holds up a kind of mirror to our own activity of intentional Promethean organization of the world around us. I think peony that stands for Zadie Smith's, I don't know, romanticism. She wants a classier flower than the tulip. She's a romantic and academic, not that kind of woman. She has this cultural pretension she recognizes in herself. So we define ourselves by contrast to others, just a conceptual contrast like white and black, self-other, and to reality. I'm Promethean. My seeing is not just passive reception of the tulip, but it's an active seeing, inspired by imagination. The tulip inspires a vision of something beyond, of a flower, a more perfect flower, a rarer flower, the peonies. But Zadie Smith is also like a romantic poet. So we'll have ample time to talk about, or I'll find ample occasion to bring up romantic poetry. Zadie Smith is also, by the end, characterizes her piece as nonsense. The world reduces my attempt at coherence, a kind of vision of beauty, to nonsense. What does it mean when a writer, why does she write and publish nonsense, gibberish? She advertises her failure. Why? It's again yin and yang. It's like you have asked me to read this piece that you've intricately woven through your careful prose and description, and thoughtful reflections on our present circumstance, and then dismiss it as nonsense on the last page. What's this yin and yang of organization, explanation, analysis, making coherent, and dismissing the whole project of explanation as nonsense. The point again is that there's a deeper truth in this interplay, inevitable interplay of the two sides of this opposition, of these various oppositions. That's what we're emulating. That's what experience means. The experience of being in the dance of life rather than reducing it to a objective explanation or causal account. What we are, who we are, what we share with each other about our experience is what exceeds, what can't be reduced to either a discrete empirical object or causal sequence. And yet, that's all we have in the sense of language. And that language forces us to, again, to be rational, to speak in terms of discrete objectivity. And I'll just leave you with this. This is what I think I've learned. I think I've learned from this course. In so late into my life of reading, spending my time reading, and I used to always think literature is about the highest, most refined expression of language, and poetry is does makes the most highest, most refined use of language. But now I've come to understand that the poetry is about sabotaging language, using it against itself, mobilizing opposition to contort meaning, distort and undermine our sense of the sense of understanding the world objectively, which is the premise of language. So that's this course where it's about life writing, and the how we do it, how we represent the reality of our experience to one another, and what a complex but beautiful art nonfiction prose is.